Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. The Obama administration is currently considering a proposal to send more arms to CIA-backed anti-Assad forces in Syria. According to the Washington Post, Obama has not made a decision yet and could leave it up to whoever wins the election in November. This, of course, raises questions of what would a President Hillary Clinton or President Donald Trump do in Syria. This has also been the topic at the presidential debates recently. Joining us now to discuss the Clintons and Trump's approaches to foreign policy is Larry Wilkerson. Larry is a retired United States Army soldier and former Chief of Staff to the United States Secretary of State, Colin Powell. He has also just published an article in the National Interest, written together with Gordon Adams, about this topic. Larry, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Sharmini.
So, Larry, in your recent piece titled "No, Hillary Clinton's Foreign Policy Judgment Isn't as Good as Everyone Says," you argued that a case for Clinton as a better foreign policy president on the basis of knowledge and experience. Now, factoring all of this in and what's going on in Washington in terms of how they should behave or what foreign policy actions or military actions needs to be taking place in Syria, how do you think Hillary Clinton would act?
I'm very concerned about it. I can tell you that right up front. Her posture with regard to Syria in general, when she was Secretary of State, and some of the remarks she's made during the campaign lead me to believe she'll be very bellicose with regard to Syria. I hope I'm wrong. I hope better judgment prevails. But as I said in the National Interest article, I'm not all that convinced of it. And that's based primarily on her track record with regard to Libya, which is now a disaster. And it's my understanding, and I think it's a pretty solid understanding, that she was one of the, if not the principal advocates of action in Libya when President Obama, somewhat reluctantly, I think, decided to do it following NATO into that country. And she was also an advocate of the war with Iraq and regime change there. And so in those two instances, her judgment was flawed, seriously flawed, you could argue. And based on her rhetoric with regard to Syria, I certainly don't want to see that kind of judgment continued in that regard.
And in the recent debate, she was advocating a no-fly zone over Syria. What does that mean, and what implications will it have in terms of geopolitical allegiances at this time?
We're not dealing with a Libyan Air Force or an Iraqi Air Force, or indeed a Syrian Air Force. What we're dealing with here is Russian air forces, perhaps even, as you and I were just discussing, eventually Chinese air forces, though they're not there now, I don't think, and the Syrian air forces. So if we go in to establish a no-fly zone and we're serious about it, the first airplane that penetrates that zone is all important because you've just about got to shoot it down. And if it's a Russian airplane, you're in trouble because you've now performed an act of war against Russia in Syria. What that means, we'll just have to wait and see, but I don't think it'll mean anything good for either side or ultimately for Syria. So we're talking about if we lay down something like a no-fly zone and say, this is it, as of midnight on such and such a time, no aircraft can fly through here. And suddenly, 5 minutes later, even a Russian aircraft flies through. We have two choices. We shoot it down and risk war with Russia, and that has all kinds of ramifications that are outside Syria as well as in Syria. Or we back off our claim and look like ineffectual boobs. I don't think either of those outcomes is conducive to U.S. national security interests, so I don't think we should go there in the first place.
Right. Larry, recently I did an interview with former CIA analyst Ray McGovern, and he said that President Putin in Russia sees the next few months before potential Clinton presidency as a window of opportunity for consolidating Russia's position in the Ukraine and in Syria. Now, many world leaders are predicting that a Clinton, as you have just done, will likely to escalate the situation, particularly in Syria, that this is an area that President Obama has been restrained with. Do you think that Ray is correct, that Putin is consolidating his power, and will Hillary Clinton, in your assessment, go head on with Putin?
I'm concerned about it, as I said before, because of her previous actions and because of some of the people she has advising her who look a lot like the people who were advising George W. Bush in his first administration from 2001 to 2005, of which I was a rather intimate member. So I am concerned about it. I hope that once she is in the Oval Office, and if indeed she's elected and she gets all the briefings and is brought up to speed and so forth, and she gets the counsel of her military leaders, she will be more circumspect and more rational, let us say, than she has been sometimes compelled to be on the political circuit and on the campaign trail. That's my hope. But as I said, based on her track record, I have some concern. Perhaps not as much as Ray, but I still have some concern.
Right. Now, there's been a number of other defense analysts in recent years who argue that the president has relatively little room to maneuver because the intelligence community, the Defense Department, and the State Department are the ones that really run foreign policy and military strategy. To what extent is that correct, since you've been at the center of all of this?
Defense Department does have an inordinate amount of influence on the national security decision-making process. There's no question about that, as do other nefarious influences like Lockheed Martin, Halliburton, and all those usual suspects we've heard about, who influence congressional decision-making and ultimately influence where the money goes and so forth. I think probably in this particular instance, though, with regard to Syria, what I'm hearing is the military, and particularly the Joint Chiefs of Staff, are reluctant to enter this fray with the potential for starting a shooting war with Russia. So I hope that what I'm hearing is correct, and that they will act as a brake on any precipitate military action that then President Clinton or President Trump, for that matter, would be willing or want to order. And let me just say that Trump has been all over the sheet of music, if you will, on this, but the remarks I have heard that resonate with me are those that would keep us out of these small wars on the periphery of empire, if you will, that cost a fortune in blood and treasure and don't really promise to, and rarely do, solve anything. They certainly don't bring peace to unstable regions and regions in conflict as Syria is today. They just make things worse.
Right. And then finally, Larry, when Hillary Clinton became the Secretary of State and there was this very public pronouncement of resetting relations with Russia, what went wrong? Why are we where we are now, where she's accusing the Russians of hacking into emails? And, as you know, there's controversy over what she actually said in the debate in terms of the Russian involvement in all of this. Why is she escalating this? And then what went wrong with resetting the relations with Russia?
And what went wrong with resetting the relationship was us, the U.S. of A. We have wasted no opportunity to make Mr. Putin more powerful politically in his own country. As soon as he figured out that sticking his fingers in Washington's eyes was a winning political formula, you could guarantee you were going to get more fingers in our eyes. And more so than that, geopolitically and geostrategically, that is to say, in the heart of Russia's near abroad, we have been making moves from Ukraine to Georgia. And we have been making moves that anyone, including myself, being the ruler of a country, erstwhile great power, and seeing it happen, would be responding to. And responding to with the elements of national power, which I have, that can compensate for weaknesses that I have too. And by that, I mean I'd be responding with everything from cyber warfare to little green men to whatever I had that was competent and powerful in my arsenal that I felt like I could win with against the United States and ultimately against NATO. And that's precisely what Putin has been doing. You could almost sit down and map it. Every time we make a mistake, they capitalize on that mistake. And I don't just mean mistakes as in execution or mistakes in being somewhere where we shouldn't be at a particular time. I mean policy mistakes. The policy mistake most glaringly pushing ourselves into Russia's near abroad and NATO along with us with ballistic missile defense, with exercises and so forth. If I were Putin, I would have responded the same way. I like to think that I've been just as smart as he has, and I'd capitalize on my strengths against our weaknesses, and I would have gained the political capital that he's gained in the course of this time. It's not all totally our fault, but a whole lot of it is.
Right. So if we are collecting our thoughts here, Larry, a Russian, Chinese now, possibly Iranian collaboration over Syria are serious times we are contending with.
And Russia exercising for the first time since the death of Anwar Sadat with the Egyptians. Russia selling major armaments to the Egyptians for the first time since, I think, about that same time period. The world is changing. Power is shifting. And the United States needs not to be fearful of such changes, but it needs to be a lot smarter about how it plays those changes to its own benefit. And one of the things it needs to be most smart about is fewer deployments of its own military forces to get engaged in things like we've been engaged in for the past 20 years, things like Afghanistan, things like Iraq, things like Syria, and so forth. We really have no capability to influence these conflicts, these basically civil wars and so forth, and trying to do so from the opening, as we did in Afghanistan with the Mujahideen, for example, by having the CIA essentially arm everybody we can find that looks like he might be a freedom fighter, only to discover months or maybe half a year or so later that they're anything but freedom fighters, that indeed they're using some of the weapons that we sold them on our own troops or on our own formations, is just not the answer. It simply doesn't work clandestinely or openly to support elements in these conflicts that we know basically don't have a hair's breadth chance of winning. The mistake here in Syria has been, as I've said it all along, and that is our attempt to get rid of Bashar al-Assad. We need to face up to that mistake. We need to be more receptive to his remaining in power in some guise. And the best we probably could get at the negotiating table is that maybe he'll be gone sometime in the unspecified future. But we need to understand that sometimes we have to give a little too, especially if we want to stop the bloodshed in Syria, which is reaching proportions where everyone in the world ought to be appalled at it.
All right, Larry, I look forward to your report next week as things really escalate and intensify over Syria. Thank you for joining us.
Well, let's hope that no one else decides to throw in their lot with the forces in Syria. China and Russia are quite enough. Thank you very much.
Indeed. I thank you again, and thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.